Hello and welcome back to another episode of the On the Sideline podcast with Jackson and Kyle. I am Jackson, and I am joined by the man who may or may not think that Mike Zimmer is a better defensive play caller than Bill Belichick. It is Kyle. Kyle, how are you doing?
I'm good. I feel like I'm betraying my own team, but no, I think both are very good head coaches, so I can't fault either one. I just think Zimmer's defensive prowess is one of the best.
Yes. Okay. We don't have to listen to last week's if you missed it. We are continuing our journey of previews of all of the teams in the NFL. We're going division by division. We've already done the NFC East and the NFC North. We are now moving to the NFC West. This is a very interesting division. Many consider this to be the best division in football on paper. It certainly probably has the best, I would say, like quarterbacks and head coaches. It's at least up there.
Yeah, I think so. By my metrics, it is by a pretty significant margin, actually, the best division in football. It had a couple points ahead of just about every other division. There are a couple that were 2 points closer, but overall, I do think that it was the best division in football, and that's mainly because I feel pretty confident that two teams have a realistic shot at making the Super Bowl, and that I have one team that I feel pretty confident could be a playoff team if things fall their way. And then also the fourth team, of course, is a team that's on the rise, and I don't think they're going to be a number one pick contender. I think they're firmly into that mid-tier and could even jump into the playoff rankings, but I'm a little hesitant to name that right now. But I do think this is the best division of football because it has a very high ceiling and then a very high floor as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I agree. And, let's just get into it. For the team that you have finishing last in this division, who do you have, and explain your reasoning?
All right, so I still have the Arizona Cardinals at 4. I think that they are much improved. I think that they have a lot of things going for them. Obviously, the DeAndre Hopkins trade was, the biggest steal of the entire offseason. I still think that this team, and I like a lot of what Cliff Kingsbury did, because he showed in his first year as a head coach that he wasn't afraid to change things. He wasn't afraid to, everyone thought, oh, well, the air raid isn't going to work in NFL. Well, he wasn't afraid to do other things. He's not married to the air raid offense as everyone thought. And, they did a lot of ground game. So I liked a lot of what he did. And I just feel like this team overall is a year away. I still have some questions on certain spots on the roster. So I feel like that they're going to be very good. They're going to be much improved. Like I said, I don't think they'll be a candidate to be the number one pick, but I still feel like they're a year away. So Arizona Cardinals are number 4.
Yeah. This is kind of what I think a lot of people will have. It's not too surprising. Some people are probably going to be a lot higher on the Cardinals than maybe we are. I think there's definitely a world where the Cardinals make the playoffs. I don't think that it's the most likely scenario, but I think it can happen. Also, one more thing I should have mentioned at the top of the show. If you want to listen to audio only, you can check out the audio. We have it on pretty much every podcast distributor, and also we always have those on Sunday. Like last week, our editing ran a little long, so I didn't actually get the video up until Monday. But on every Sunday, we'll have the audio. But anyways, back to the Cardinals. I'll just gonna do my 1 through 10s here because I think the coach and quarterback are probably, I think, depending on how high you are on these two things, will really impact how, in a lot of ways, how you think that this team could do next year. Because right now I have Cliff Kingsbury at a 4 and Kyler Murray at a 5. Again, I don't look at them and say, just what are they 1 out of 10? I look at my, when I did the rankings of all 32 head coaches and quarterbacks for these two positions, I go back and I check and I just plug it into wherever they landed. So Kingsbury got a 4 and Kyler Murray got a 5, largely because they're both just, inexperienced. How do you feel about that?
I think that's fair. I said it before on our coaches and quarterbacks podcast that I'm very, very cautious about 1-year guys because I want to see it again. I do think that the one thing I felt about Murray, especially when you looked at, if you look at his draft class, there's things about essentially. So Daniel Jones, it was like, he looked really good, but he's got to fix a few things. He's got to fix some turnovers. He's got to fix some of that stuff. Gardner Minshew, it's like, yeah, he looks really good, but you question his arm strength and how long that's going to hold up in the league and how much the Jaguars believe in him. I felt like Murray, he did have some turnover issues. He had 12 picks, but I felt like Murray was kind of above and beyond better than everybody else in that draft class. I feel like he was, he was rightfully justified as the number one pick, but you want to see a consistency. You want to see some improvement out of him in his second year. I think he's going in that direction, but you want to see it get there before you're ready to say that he's he's a 7 or an 8, which is that elite tier. There are some people out there who I'm saying, he's going to have that Lamar Jackson MVP kind of leap. Well, let's see it before it happens. Nobody was predicting Lamar was going to win the MVP last year in July 14th, but once we saw him on the field in year 2, we realized just how special he was and how special he was going to be that season. I want to see that from Murray before I believe it. That's kind of a conservative take, but that's kind of how I feel about that. And it's the same thing with Kingsbury. I feel like he did a very good job of adjusting some things to his game plan, especially, he is that offensive guy, and that's what he's, it's been his calling card his entire career at Texas Tech. I thought he did he did a very good job of, transitioning to a run-heavy game when everyone thought he was going to, drop back and throw the ball potentially 40 times in that sort of offense. And he did a very good job of adjusting and saying, what, this stuff needs to be fixed. And, he has more talent around him to work with as far as that offensive set.
Yeah, a lot of good stuff there. I think for Murray, again, 5 doesn't sound great. He's in the same tier as Jared Goff and Ben Roethlisberger, which is kind of that. I definitely have seen good things from you, but I still need to see a little bit more before I'm willing to say, okay, this is someone who is top of the league type. And so again, these are two things that I could definitely see ending up being 9s at the end of the year. But for now, they're kind of middle of the pack until they can really get there. And from that, we move on to the offensive line. Offensive line, probably the most criticized part of their team, and rightfully so. You have Mason Cole at center. You also have Justin Pugh and J.R. Sweezy as the two guards. I think Pugh is probably their best offensive lineman. Sweezy's solid. Cole is okay, I guess. Josh Jones, who is a rookie that got in the 3rd round, who I think he could be a solid starter. I think he was probably a 2nd-round talent who fell to the 3rd round. And then you have DJ Humphries, again, fine, nothing spectacular. I feel like a lot of these guys are really the only person I would say that is above the average tier for an offensive lineman would be Pugh. And even he's not like elite or anything. I just think he's above average. So offensive line for me, I'm giving it a 3. I don't think it's atrocious, but I would say it's bad. I think a 3 feels right for me.
Yeah, I do think this is still a bottom 10 line. I don't think it was as abysmal as it was a couple years ago, but I think overall it was a step forward. But at the same time, you're looking at guys. So you mentioned Humphries, who got paid like a top tier kind of guy almost, and he had his best year last year, and I think it was his 5th year in the NFL or 4th year in the NFL. So I mean, having something like that, you question how good he's going to be going forward, if he's going to hit that elite tier that they're obviously hoping for with the contract they gave him. I was actually kind of fascinated because I was reading a little bit about the Cardinals, and they were the 9th best pass blocking team according to Pro Football Focus, which I thought was interesting. But at the same time, I think that there's still going to be room to improve there. I think a lot of it is going to be quick passing game. And the tough thing too, I think, especially with a guy like Kyler Murray, and this is my problem with the Cardinals, is a similar problem I had with the Browns last year when everyone was ready to put the Browns as the AFC North champions, is especially with the short quarterback, having a good offensive line is like essential. And this offensive line is just not good enough, I think, to put them at that tier where they're going to win 10, 11 games.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and you could probably talk me into the offensive line even being as up to a 5. The one thing I do like about the line is that I feel like there's no like clear hole. So there's no real weakness. So I actually did struggle a little bit with it. But again, I just there's nothing that I really am excited about, I guess, on the line. So that's why I gave it a 3. But there is plenty to be excited about in terms of their receivers. I mean, obviously, you talked about it earlier. DeAndre Hopkins being the steal of the offseason. Larry Fitzgerald is interesting because obviously he's getting up there in age, but he seemingly can continue to produce. And, now he won't be the number 1 guy. You also have Christian Kirk, who I think is good. And even a couple of guys who could end up being good. Sort of a small sample size from what they did last year. Andy Isabella and Keyshawn Johnson. It's an interesting receiving core. And I'm going to give this a 9. I think that DeAndre Hopkins by himself is going to do so much. And I think there's enough talent here that they can pretty much have a receiving core that against almost all teams will be able to get open with some consistency.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about Fitzgerald and his age, which is fair, but at the same time, at 35, he was still top 26 in the league in receptions. So, I mean, he's still got it, and he's now their number 3 guy, essentially. He's going to be working primarily out of the slot because I think Kirk is kind of that boomer bust guy on the outside. And, I really like this team. I would even put it a 10. I think it's that good. I think the question you have is maybe depth. I really liked a guy like Damiere Byrd, who they ended up letting go because they brought in Hopkins. But, that top 3 is better than just about anybody else in the league.
Well, yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, I think Christian Kirk is good. I've yet to see Christian Kirk, I would say, be I think he's good. I think he's just good. And I think Larry Fitzgerald, I think the age is a big enough concern that I could see a scenario where they kind of end up being the Green Bay Packers of they have Devontae Adams and nothing else. I don't think that'll happen. I think they'll be fine. But that's why I just gave him the extra point, basically because of my concerns of Fitzgerald's age.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, we'll see what happens as he gets, I wouldn't be surprised if he puts in another 75 catch season because he's Larry Fitzgerald and that's just who he is and that's what he does. But, there is going to be a time where we're like, oh, wow, Fitzgerald is just, tanked.
Right. It's going to happen eventually. We thought it would have happened a couple years ago, but it's still there. So who knows? And I think we all hope that he is able to just play forever. But from that, we'll move on to the backs. The backs are interesting. You have Kenyon Drake, Chase Edmonds. I'm going to give them a 4. And again, I feel like every time I give a grade for backs, it feels lower than it actually should be. But that's just because there's so many good backs. I think that these are 2 guys who they did very well, but I think they did very well largely because of the Kingsbury system with Murray being a guy who can run the ball. And I wonder how much they could do in a vacuum. I don't know how much they're actually going to. I think they're statistically better than they actually are. But that being said, I still think that they're 2 guys who can play in this system well. And are they going to be, making too much more yards after what the offensive line gave them? I don't know. But are they going to be able to at least get the yards that the team around them gets? Yes. So that's why I still say I think they're a 4. I could be I'm probably closer to a 5 than a 3, but that's my grade.
Yeah, I think a lot of the Drake hype was because he wasn't David Johnson last year. And, this is another one back to the Humphreys thing, but even more so, I think, for running backs is his best year was in his 5th year, and it was only half a season. How much of that you're going to have in a running back? Running backs, at best, you're thinking 7-year lifespan almost for running backs. Typically, he's already heading into year 6, and he had his best year last year compared to the other years where he was just fine. In 8 games last year, he had his 2nd most carries for his entire career. I think that the one thing Drake does have going for him is that he's always been a good receiving back, and this Cardinals offense loves to use their running backs out of the backfield, catching balls. So I think that's something that he's going to do very well. I think one guy to keep an eye on that I really like, and I liked him out of college, was Eno Benjamin. He was a 7th round pick because he was a little slow, but I do think that he showed in games that he was good enough to be a running back, and I think that he's going to put together some good years in the NFL. Maybe not his rookie year, but I think he's heading in the right direction. So I think a 4 is fair. You could probably talk me into even a 3 because, a lifetime backup is now essentially their number 1 guy. And, who knows what's going to happen with that, but I'm not convinced that he's going to be all of a sudden a 1,500-yard rush or anything like that.
Yeah, I think we're probably both pretty similar on the same page. And from that, we can move on to tight ends. It seems like the tight end who's probably going to end up getting the lion's share of the work will end up being Max Williams, I would assume, who is a good blocker. I don't know how very good blocker, actually. I don't know how much else they have, but I'm still giving it. I think that alone gives the tight end a 6, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this is going to be, the tight ends are pretty much just going to be used as blockers, like you said in this one. They have enough receiving talent that they're not really worried about that. So it fits what they're trying to do. Williams hasn't had more than 15 catches, I think, in his last 3 years. So Oh, excuse me, he had 16 in 2018. So he hasn't had more than
Okay.
16 in the last 3 years. So, I mean, you're not expecting a lot of the passing game, but especially for a team, like I said, that wasn't very good in run blocking last year on the offensive line, having a good tight end that can block is going to be very important for them.
Yeah, agreed. So for the offense, Arizona gets 5.4, and then we move on to the defense. First, we're going to go with the edge rushers. You have Chandler Jones, who has consistently been one of, if not the best, edge rusher in the NFL. You also have Devin Kennard, former Lion, who's good. So I'm going to give their edge rushers a 9, and I'll also do the interior defensive line here. Interior defensive line could use some work. It seems like they have a couple of fourth rounders that they're going to hope that they can get some talent in that way. Because of those 2 fourth rounders is the only reason I'm not giving them a 1, because you have Zach Allen, Corey Peters, and Jordan Phillips. Not exactly something to write home about outside of that. So their interior defensive line gets a 2, but their edge rushers get a 9.
Yeah, Phillips is another one where it's like, let's see if he can keep up with the production he had last year. He didn't have a ton of tackles, but he was able to be a big pass rusher up the interior. So I think that's fair. But of course, the edge rushers is where this defense is highlighted with a guy like Jones. You could probably talk me into a 10 almost for this. But, if we're splitting hairs here, this isn't the Bears defense edge rushers who we gave a 10 last week. So or the Packers edge rushers who we gave a 10 last week. Jones is a 10, but as a whole, they're probably an 8 or a 9, like you said. So yeah, I think those are both justified for that defense. It's an okay front 7.
Yeah, and again, yeah, I probably should have mentioned that, but yeah, of course, Phillips 9.5 sacks, but yeah, I'm still not very high on that interior defensive line. And we'll move on to the linebackers. Linebackers is another interesting one. I believe Isaiah Simmons is going to be a linebacker. Again, it's I said I think he's more of a safety than a linebacker, but looks like they're going to have him be in a linebacker position. You also have Jordan Hicks. So I think this linebacker, it could be very good. It could end up being not that great. A lot of it depends on how well Simmons does in that position, in that role. So I'm giving it a 5 for now.
Yeah, I think this is fair because I was just about to say, how do we grade Simmons when we don't know what area he's going to play? I'm kind of with you that I think he's going to be kind of that hybrid guy. He might be, and I think his long-term fit is probably a Jabril Peppers role where he's maybe an all-pro version of Jabril Peppers. But, I don't know if he's going to be an interior linebacker. I question the size of this linebacker group and how good they're going to be, especially against a heavy run team, like a team like Seattle that loves to go up the middle. That could be a question that I have. So I think a 5 is justified. And until I see Simmons and where he's playing, it could be lower too.
Yeah, agreed. And then last, to round things out for the Cardinals, we have the secondary. Secondary is an interesting one because they have obviously Patrick Peterson, who is great. You have Budda Baker, who is good. And then it comes down to the other guys. You have, for the cornerbacks, you have Byron Murphy, who definitely showed some flashes last year. He also gave up 10 touchdowns, which is not good. So he's had his hits and misses. They also have Robert Alford as well. And then for safeties, Jalen Thompson. I'm going to give their secondary a 6 because I think that, a young corner could grow, could get better. You also have Robert Alford, who has clearly been a good number 2 corner in the past. So I think their corners could be good. I think that Budda Baker is good. And so, again, I'm not going to go buy a Jalen Thompson jersey anytime soon. But I still think that the secondary is solid. I'm going to give the secondary a 6, and that gives the defense as a whole a 5.5. What do you think about that?
I would actually probably have this secondary a little higher. I really like Baker in his game. Obviously, Peterson is still Peterson. Maybe not as high level as he was, but he's still a very productive cornerback. I think Murphy's really good, and I think he's going to be good going forward. And I think Alford, especially with, he's going to have less responsibility, I think, than he did those last couple of years in Atlanta, where he was exposed a little bit. And he's going to be kind of that third corner, which I think will help because I don't think he was the top level corner that they were trying to make him to be. So I would actually grade this as a 7 or 8. I think this is going to be a pretty good secondary with all those pieces coming together.
Yeah, that's fair enough. So for my grading system, this gives them 5.3, definitely on the lower side. But, for them to be, for them to become a playoff team, I think the part of it is if Jordan Phillips turns out to not be a fluke and plays a lot, continues what he did, the interior defensive line gets better. The fourth rounders do kind of come through. And then I think that if the offensive line is able to be what we hope it can be, if you're a Cardinals fan, of just being, more successful, and then obviously Kingsbury and Murray take the step to the next level, I think that's the way that they could, make the playoffs or even make a run. Although I think there's too many ifs right now for me to feel confident that they're going to be a playoff team. But that's what I think. Are you on the same page here?
Yeah, like I said, I think that this team is heading in the right direction. I like a lot of the core that they have, that young core with the young coach, the young quarterback. They're heading in that direction, that they're going to be very good going forward. The tough part is that A, they're still really young. B, there's questions on the interior of the offensive line and the defensive line, which is a bad thing to have, especially when you talk about this division. And, if we're talking about this division as the best team or best division in football, that's a tough one to beat all the, 6 times. And even to win 3 of these games, I think they'll be lucky, because all these other teams, the 49ers and the Rams run the ball so well. That's not where you want to have a weakness on the defensive interior of the defensive line. So I think that they're heading in the right direction, but there still are, I think, 2 or 3 really key pieces away.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I agree. There's a chance it works out, but not enough that I'm going to bet my life savings on it. And so we'll move on now to the number 3 team. Who do you have as the team that is going to be not worst in division, but second worst in the division?
So I went back and forth on this one. I had a really tough time with this, actually. I like both of these teams a lot. I think one of them is kind of a fringe Super Bowl team. Like, if I had Super Bowl contenders, they'd probably be my worst contender. And one is probably my best, not quite a contender, but a good playoff team. I think they'd be one of the best ones. At the end of the day, I am going to go with the Los Angeles Rams at 3. You could easily talk me into 2, because I do think that they're that good. Everyone, I think, overblew kind of what McVay lost his touch. He was cursed in that Super Bowl. I still think that they were very good on offense despite all the injuries. And, when you lose a guy like Todd Gurley, who you build your entire offense around, of course it's going to get slightly worse. He was hurt his entire last season he was there. Of course the offense is going to get a little worse. But I do think that there's pieces at this team that they're going to be very good again. At the end of the day, I have questions about the offensive line. I have questions about what they did with some of their cap space, that I think that they're going to finish third in this division just because it's so competitive. And if I'm splitting hairs between them and the team that's number 2, which is the Seahawks for me, which we'll talk to later, if I'm splitting hairs, I'm going tie goes to the quarterback and Russell Wilson. So I'll go with the Rams at 3.
Okay. Well, I agree as well. I'm not sure if it's for all the same reasonings, but I'm pretty much with you. I also do feel like a lot of, the depth of the Los Angeles Rams has been greatly exaggerated. But let's just start off with the 2 big main billings. If it's a movie poster, these are the 2 guys going on the front. Sean McVay and Jared Goff. McVay, he gets an 8, which feels right. He's been a very good coach since he's entered the league. Quarterback, Jared Goff got a 5. He was in the middle tier, but also due to their lack of really any semblance of a backup at this point, looks like their second string is currently undrafted John Wolford, who has never played a snap in the NFL. So for that, I am going to dock them a point. So quarterback room gets a 4, with the head coach getting an 8 in Sean McVay.
Yeah, I mean, like I said in the intro to them, I still think McVay's I still think he's a very creative play caller. He's a very good coach. The Goff thing is so interesting to me. You watch him on one game and it's like you see exactly why this guy was the number 1 pick. You watch him another game and it's like, has he ever held a football before? But at the same time, his numbers really were pretty identical. He was 50 yards lower than he had in 2018, where everyone regarded him as awesome. And his completion percentage was pretty close. He was a 63% instead of a 65%. Overall, it was the turnovers that were the biggest difference, though he was dealing with a lot of injuries across his offense that I think hindered him a little bit. But I think that's fair that it's a 4 overall. You could talk me into Goff himself being a 4, but I still think that he has enough arm talent that he's going to be pretty good in this league for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I don't know. I think if I were to pick Goff, I'd probably say he's closer to a 6 than a 4 myself. But I think that, but yeah, I mean, he only threw 22 touchdowns last year, which was down 10 touchdowns from the year prior. that's going to hurt him to some degree. But let's talk about really, I think probably the biggest drop off last year was the offensive line play. Part of it was injuries, but you have basically everyone other than Austin Corbett, who is a guard, who I mean, he wasn't. Yeah, pretty much everyone else was really good in 2018, and then had a drop off in 2019. I think Whitworth was the one guy who still played pretty well in 2019. But other than that, you saw a significant decrease in play. And part of me just wonders if it had to do with Gurley just not being as, not being healthy. And that sort of, Gurley maybe made them look a little better. And now Gurley maybe not being there makes them look a little worse. I think the offensive line is so difficult to really get a good grade on. I'm going to give them a 5 just because I feel like, I could see them being a top 10 or a bottom 10 offensive line next year. I really could.
Yeah, the drop off with these guys are pretty staggering, like you said. I think it's interesting to see, was it the Gurley injury and he's just not hitting those holes quick enough? So, that split second to hit the hole, it's just not there anymore. So it makes the offensive line grade look significantly worse. Is it a Super Bowl hangover sort of thing where they get that close to the Super Bowl? I don't believe too much in all these superstitious sort of things, but at the same time, I do feel like that there's enough evidence of these Super Bowl hangovers, especially for the losing team, that it can be a significant thing for the next season and how they perform. I could, like you said, though, I could see this jumping back into being a top 7, top 6 offensive line in the league, because I don't think these guys got worse. I think that there was a lot of variables to this Rams team that led to their regression.
Yeah. So, and that's why they get a 5. Again, I could easily see this. And I think if the line gets better, then I think that Goff will get better as well. So, if they could just get a couple points up, that could also bring Goff up a couple points, and that could be a huge swing. And that could turn them into the Super Bowl contenders. We'll move on to the receivers. They lost Cooks, but they still have Robert Woods, who Troy Aikman says is the best receiver in football, along with Cooper Kupp. I do think both of those guys are very underrated. They also have Josh Reynolds, who I think is good. And they drafted Van Jefferson in the second round. I'm going to give the receiving core an 8. Again, I don't quite know if they have a ton of guys who can, they don't have that, DeAndre Hopkins, but everyone can run routes. Everyone can run routes well. And I do believe that Kupp and Woods can both beat man coverage relatively consistently. And so for me, I still give them an 8.
Are we sure they don't have a top 10 guy? Cooper Kupp was 9th in receptions, 12th in yards, 2nd in touchdowns. Are we sure he's not that kind of guy? I think he's very good. A lot of it is the offense too. That play action probably does a lot very good for him. But at the same time, I think he's probably, if you're grading wide receivers, I don't think it's crazy to put him in the top 15 at this point. He was that good last year.
Yeah, I don't think it's crazy either. I never said he's not top. I didn't make any number drop off. I just said I don't think he's there's that elite tier. I don't think he's elite. I think he's and I think there's probably 7 guys in the NFL that are elite, maybe a little bit, maybe more, maybe less, I don't know, in terms of receivers. I don't think he's in that group, but I think that he's one group below. And I think Woods is also in the same category of Kupp. I think they're both very good. That's why I gave him an 8.
Yeah, I agree. I think they're both very good, like you said. Josh Reynolds is, of course, he's been a productive third guy the last few years. I think, Van Jefferson's a very good route runner that's going to, be productive his first year as long as he's healthy. So I do think that this is an 8, maybe even a 9 for me.
Okay. Yeah. And then we'll move on to the backs. For the backs, you have Cam Akers, who is probably going to be I think this entire team could potentially rely on how well a rookie Cam Akers does. Because he definitely had. I think there is a scenario where he could do very well, and this could, he could be the new Todd Gurley of this offense. Not saying he will be to that talent level, but he could be what the offense runs around. But again, he is a rookie, and we've seen rookies, especially even halfbacks, bust before. And outside of that, they have Darrell Henderson and Malcolm Brown. I'm giving their backs a 4 again. It doesn't feel like it's good enough for me to say because of a rookie I'm going to, have full confidence. This is probably the biggest question mark for the Rams, but if it's answered, it could be a great thing for them.
Yeah, I'd probably put this at closer to a 6 just because I liked Akers so much out of college. I know it's his first year, but I don't really care. I think he's that good. The question is going to be, this offense is very clearly predicated on a good running game and a consistent running game. I think that much is very clear. I don't think there's that much of a regression from their offense last season, but I do think that it's significantly better when the run game's at that level that it should be, especially when I had a guy like Gurley and how good it was when he was at his peak. So the question is then, how good does Akers need to be for this offense to be back to its elite tier?
I mean, he would probably have for it to be elite. Again, for one thing, I'm not entirely sure if I would say that he's just enough by himself because they probably could need some backup. But I would say he probably has to be like for the offense to be elite, he probably have to be at least the top 10 running back.
Yeah, so I was thinking he would he essentially then need to have Ezekiel Elliott rookie numbers.
I don't think it have to be that good, but it would somewhere in the ballpark probably.
Yeah, but I mean, I do think that he's good enough. I think this. People question when to draft running backs, but I think this running back draft was that good. Otherwise, any other year, I think he's debated as one of the first running backs taken off the board. But because there are so many good running backs, I think at the top, I actually kind of thought he was better than Jonathan Taylor because of Taylor's fumbling issues. And I think the Rams got a steal with getting him that when they did. So I do think that Akers can be very good. It's just a question of how good does he need to be, like you said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was high on Cam Akers out of the draft too, but I also recognize, there's plenty of guys I thought were going to be great after the draft and have struggled. So it's still a question mark for me. And we'll move on to the tight ends here. You have Tyler Higbee and Gerald Everett. I think they also drafted a tight end in the 4th round. I think this is a very good tight end group. I'm not sure if they have, a top 5 guy, but Higbee's right outside the top 5. He's pretty much every top 10 list you have. He's going to be there. And you also have Everett, who is good. So I'm going to give this an 8.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Higbee had his best year last year, of course, year 4 for him. The weird thing for me is I feel like this should be better because I almost feel like every time I watch Gerald Everett and I just watch him move, I'm like, this guy should torch every linebacker that covers him. I just think he's that athletic and that talented. But then you look at his numbers and he's like, oh, he had, 4 catches for 28 yards. And you're like, oh, well, I guess that was a solid game. That's essentially what Gerald Everett's career has been to me. I feel like he should be a lot better than he is. And then sometimes I look at his number and he's like, oh, maybe he's not that good. But he's, a very good number 2 tight end for me.
Yeah. And I think Higbee's just not threatening enough of a name. I think
that's
no one's threatened by Higbee. We'll move on. So the offense, again, it feels weird having the offense 5.8, which isn't a terrible score, but it feels like that seems low. But again, part of that is the quarterback room getting a 4 and the line getting a 5 and the backs getting a 4. Those are all 3 things that could end up being an 8 or a 9 at the end of the season. So it's an interesting, there's a very difficult team to grade, I think. But we'll move on to the defense. You have for edge rushers, you have Leonard Floyd and Samson Edekon, who are both good. Again, I'm giving this a 5. It feels 5 worthy for me. You also have the interior defensive line. You have Ashawn Robinson, who has had some good years for Detroit. And I think maybe him getting out of that, Patricia locker room could be a good thing. You have Michael Brockers as well, who I think is very good, and Sebastian Joseph Day, who I think is probably pretty underrated. And that Aaron Donald guy, he might be okay. So I'm going to give them a 10 because I think that they have guys who can work around Donald, and Donald, I think Brockers is really good. I think Donald is obviously I would say he's the best player in football. And then you have, Joseph Day or Robinson can easily be that 3rd guy. It's an easy 10 for me.
Yeah, Aaron Donald's very good at football breaking news. That's interesting. You put him at number 1. I would still have Mahomes, but that's a different podcast debate. But Donald is such high level player, and he's made the defensive tackle almost more important than the edge rusher. I think to me, I think that game changing defensive tackle can just change teams, and he is that guy, and he makes this front 7, a very high level because he's just that good, and he's probably going to win Defensive Player of the Year again. He's that good.
Yeah, it seems very likely. And then we'll move on to the linebackers that aren't edge rushers. So this is an interesting one because they don't have much. I mean, you have Micah Kaiser, who was he was a 3rd round pick, or excuse me, a 5th round pick 3 years ago. He didn't play much. He had some playing time in 2018, wasn't fantastic. 2019, he didn't play at all. So he's definitely a big question mark. You also have Kenny Young and Troy Reader. I'm not sure if you're going to get too hyped up over that. I don't really know what the plan is for the linebacking group, but I'm not exactly why going crazy over it. I am going to give this a 1.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's a pretty weak group. I mean, obviously they have that interior defensive line in front of them. So I think that they felt like that this wasn't a huge need to address. They also have, I think, they're going to run a lot of nickel. I think that's what they're going to do because they have some talent at the cornerback position. They have Jalen Ramsey at the cornerback position, which allows them to kind of alter a lot of their defense because he can work on an island. And so I don't think that they felt like this linebacker need was too serious, but there are guys on the market that I think would be valuable to this team. What's the Eagles linebacker that's still available? Bradham?
Eagles. I'm not sure.
But, there are
I expect a pop quiz.
Yeah. But there are linebackers available that I think that they could add to this roster to kind of improve it. But I think that they have an interior defensive line that's elite. Nigel Bradham, that's who I was going with, who I believe is still a free agent. But, there are a lot of, their interior defensive line is what drives this group, what I was trying to say.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah. Definitely. And I think that we can also, I think their secondary is good as well. And we'll go there. So you have Taylor Rapp, who was he's in his second year now. He was second round pick, so wasn't necessarily fantastic his rookie season, but showed some flashes and could continue to improve. You have John Johnson, who like many of the Rams, is coming off of his career worst season. He's been a player for 3 years, but he was very good in his first 2. Last year was not a great one for him. And then you have they drafted a 4th rounder for a safety. And also for corners, you have Jalen Ramsey. And, I mean, I also thought Troy Hill was very good last year as well. I think that 1-2 punch for corners is very good. Again, we'll have to see a little bit on how much Taylor Rapp ends up improving from year 1 to year 2. Also, John Johnson, there is some question mark of just, did he just get lucky for a couple years, or is last year the real John Johnson, or is this year going to be, or was it a fluke? I'm giving them an 8.
Yeah, I do think that this is high level, and of course they have, one of the best cornerbacks in football, and Jalen Ramsey, with Johnson, of course, with the 2-year sample size, that he was, a very high level player, and then of course last year he was very average player. The question, like I said, kind of with the offensive line. So do we just kind of write off a lot of the Rams as a Super Bowl hangover? Because, you have a lot of these guys that just had these random drop-offs. It's hard to rate these guys. Do you rate them on 2019 performance, or do you rate them on career performance, which is going to be the question that everyone asks? Because I do think that a lot of these players are still really good. They just didn't show it last year. So what changes this year basically is what happens.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, I could see it going either way. It's a total guessing game. And so, some people, I'm sure, in the media are going to say the Rams are going to win Super Bowl because if the 10% chance that, they do really well, people can then brag about it afterwards. And some people will say the Rams will suck because there's a 10% chance that'll happen and they'll feel really good about themselves afterwards. But the reality is none of us really know. And it's sort of just a guessing game at this point, which is why I think that, as a whole, their defense ends up being 6.0. Their total score is 6.1, which is good. It's a solid score. It's nothing crazy. And I think that feels right about the Rams. They're probably one of the teams I could see having the widest variance of how they could do next year.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It can completely fall off the rails, and like maybe Goff was a fraud in 2018, and Andrew Whitworth gets old, and none of the other offensive linemen get better. Some of those guys on the secondary don't pan out, and it's just Jalen Ramsey and a bunch of guys. And, that linebacking core is not going to help that secondary either, like we talked about. So, of course, then it's just how much can Sam Darnold and Aaron Donald put together? That'd be something. How much can Aaron Donald, raise this defense up is going to be the question at that point. They do have players on that defensive line, but it really is him and Ramsey, and we'll see what we can get out of some of those other guys, I think.
Yeah, and I think again the Cam Akers question mark of how well he does in his rookie season is going to be so crucial for them. So, any final thoughts on the Rams before we move on to the Seahawks?
No, I think that they're going to be solid. I guess we're going back and forth on this. If you put a gun to my face and say make a prediction on this, I would say that the Rams are going to be better. I would say that a lot of these guys bounce back and that the Rams are closer to a 10-6 team. The problem is that once again, you're looking at this division, there's no easy wins in this division. So they're going to have to navigate that. But I do think that this Rams team is going to be a playoff team. I could see a situation where both of these teams take the wild card spots.
Yeah, I can see that happening as well. And so let's talk about those Seahawks. We'll just go again. I mentioned before a lot of good coaches and quarterbacks in this division. What doesn't get too much better than Pete Carroll and Russell Wilson being your coach quarterback combo. Carroll, I forget exactly where I put him, but he was top 6 coaches in my list, so he gets a 9 here. And Wilson was the second best quarterback on my list, so he gets a 10 here. So right off the bat, 19 out of 20 points for the first 2 categories for the Seahawks.
Yeah, Wilson is, of course, I still think the second best quarterback in football. I know what Lamar did last year. I do think that if Wilson was in that same sort of offense that Lamar was in, he'd put up similar numbers. I think the one knock I have on Carroll is pretty much what he does with Wilson in this offense. I think that he could expand it more, but that's not really Carroll's game. I think he's a very high-level defensive coach. He's a culture-building guy. He's the team camaraderie kind of guy, and he's always been one of the best at that. And outside of when, Sherman had that locker room kind of in a riot, I do think that this has been one of the best cultures in football, and Carroll's proved that year after year. So I do think that this is a high-level group at coach and quarterback, which has made it one of the best teams of the decade.
Yes, and even the so-called riot Seahawks still won 9 games that year, if I remember correctly. So even then, still had a lot of success. We'll move on to I actually think that there's some interesting thing about this Seahawks team. I feel like the narrative is that it's all just Russell Wilson bailing out everyone else. I don't think that's totally fair. I think there is good talent on this team. Although I do think the offensive line struggles are fair. The complaints are fair. You have first center BJ Finley, not particularly great. For guards, it looks like Damian Lewis is going to, a 3rd-round pick. He might end up being the best guard they have. But I do like Dwayne Brown. I think he's been good. And Brandon Shell, nothing special either. They have a couple of pieces. Again, a 3rd-round pick, Damian Lewis. If he ends up being solid, fine. I do think that having a good tackle matters. But as a whole, this line is a 3, and it's closer to a 2 than a 4.
Yeah, I mean, this has been the narrative for the Seahawks for how many years now? Since they, since they traded for Jimmy Graham, this has been the question with the Seahawks. Is this offensive line, basically? They're still not very good. Brown's still a pretty high-level left tackle. But the rest of the offensive line, you're like, please just hold on. Please just hold on for as long as you can for Russell Wilson to make a play. I do think that he has a lot of skill position talent, but this offensive line hasn't been good in a few years, and the narrative still fits.
Yeah, and so let's talk about those skill positions then, because that's more fun. Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, very good 1-2 combo here. I mean, I think Tyler Lockett's probably very underrated, and Metcalf, it was that weird thing where we all saw him before the draft and thought he was going to go very early. He ends up falling to the 2nd round, so we're all like, okay, I guess we were wrong. We overhyped him, but he actually ended up being one of the better receivers for rookies. So, I think that's a very good 1-2 punch. The number 3 guy, it looks like it's going to be Philip Dorsett. So, there is a depth problem, I think. But I think that the 1-2 punch is strong enough. I'm giving this an 8.
Yeah, I actually think Dorsett's pretty good. I think that a lot of what happened with him in New England is that when you run a wrong route with Brady, he essentially freezes you out. He never throws to you again. And it's one of the most intricate offenses, especially for receivers in football. But when he is on the field, he was actually a fantastic vertical guy for the Patriots, which is something they direly needed. And he was able to be that guy when he was on the field and Brady trusted him. And I think he can be that here, which makes, these 3 guys, all 3 of them had over 13 yards per reception. This is a great vertical offense. And Russell Wilson is, of course, one of the best deep ball throwers in football, if not the best, probably besides Mahomes. He's up there in that top 2, I think, though. And he has three guys that love to run vertical routes. So I think this works out perfectly for him. I'd probably rate it a little bit higher because I do like Dorsett. And I do like what those three can do, especially with how he likes to throw the ball deep.
Well, I read a Nick Shook article that said that Dak Prescott was the best deep ball thrower in the NFL. So I don't know about that one, Kyle.
Don't throw it. Yeah, listen, I can go in on Dak Prescott if you want.
No, we only have so much time here for this podcast, Kyle. No, yeah, fair enough. And I don't know about Wilson being the second best deep ball thrower, but he's very good. And so with that, we'll just move on to the backs. I think Chris Carson is very underrated. I think Chris Carson is very good. I also think they have a lot of depth here where they drafted DJ Dallas in the 4th round. They also have Rashad Penny and Carlos Hyde. So I think that there's a lot of depth here, and I do think Carson's actually very underrated. I'm giving their backs a 7.
Yeah, I do think this is a very good group. Rashad Penny, obviously, people were really high on last year, and he kind of just didn't work out for him. I think he battled some injuries, if I remember correctly. But Carson is, of course, very good. He was, top 5 in rushing last year. His yards per carry could be a little bit better. That's something that everybody kind of wanted, but overall, I still think that he's a very productive back. Carlos Hyde had over 1,000 yards last year, which seems like kind of crazy. And then DJ Dallas is going to be the interesting one. He played a lot of quarterback in high school. He was very good at Miami, and he does a lot of different things, whether it's returning. I could see him lining up in a lot of Wildcat. I think he's very good as well, like you said.
Yeah, and then we'll move on from there for tight ends. Tight ends not really anything crazy, but you have Greg Olsen, who's 35 years old, and you have a 4th rounder, Parkinson. Again, this is a concern. I think that maybe they can get some talent out of here, but it's a certain red flag. I'm only going to give them a 3.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I don't know, what are you expecting out of Greg Wilson, I guess is the question. Because if people are asking for 2015 Greg Wilson, then you're going to be very disappointed with this team because he's not going to be 2015 Greg Wilson. I can guarantee you that. Or he hasn't had over 600 yards in 3 years. Obviously, he's been banged up the last 3 years too, which has affected it. And he's a year older, which doesn't help. I thought Jacob Hollister was solid at points last year, and I think he could be a pretty good. He's almost a 3rd tight end on this roster too. And I think Parkinson's going to be a couple years away. We've talked about it before. Long-term tight ends. Tight ends don't really pan out their rookie year. So maybe you wait a little bit for Parkinson. And then there's, of course, Will Dissly, who I thought was pretty good in a limited role last year until he got hurt. He's their number 2 guy. So, I mean, I think that there's depth at this spot, which maybe I graded a little higher because of that. But your expectations of a guy like Greg Wilson to all of a sudden turn back into like an 800-yard receiver is probably unrealistic.
Yeah. So exactly. I'm just a little bit too concerned on that. We'll move on to so offense gets a 6.2, but we'll move on to the defense. I think this defense is probably a bit underrated. For edge rushers, you have Bruce Irvin, you have Benson Mayowa, you have they drafted Darrell Taylor in the 2nd round. Also for the interior defensive line, you have Ford and Jerron Reed, who I think are both solid. So for the edge, I think this isn't something that you're going to go like wild over, but I think the edge rushers get a 5 here, and the interior defensive line gets a 6 here.
Yeah, I do think that this group is average. Bruce Irvin comes back, and I think that he, he's proven to be that sack machine. He's that pass rushing specialist that they drafted him for originally. Of course, he's obviously bounced around, and now he's back. And I think a guy like Benson Mayowa, he put together 7 sacks last year. I think that he could be a solid contributor again. So I do think that this is an average group, but I think the back half of this defense is what's really good.
Exactly. We'll move on to the linebackers. Jordan Brooks, who they drafted in the 1st round, to pair with KJ Wright and future Hall of Famer Bobby Wagner. This is a 10 out of 10 for me. This is a fantastic group.
Yeah, this is, like I said, the back half of this group is what makes this defense special. Wagner is fantastic as always, of course. And, this is a really good group. And of course, it's going to be interesting to see how Brooks is used. They drafted him because he was a pretty athletic guy at Texas Tech. It's going to be interesting to see how he's used and if he can, he's not the weak spot in this linebacking group.
Right. And then we'll move on to the secondary as well. They got Quandre Diggs from Detroit, who played very well for Seattle. Bradley McDougall I think he's sort of a replacement level player. Nothing, not a disaster out there, not someone that you hate, but he can, not someone who's he's gonna wow you too much either. You also have Shaquille Griffin, Quentin Dunbar, who I think are two very good cornerbacks. Trey Flowers for the depth is not great, but you got the solid top two corners, which I think is what you need. So for the secondary, I'm going to give them an 8. The reason why they don't get anything higher is simply because, again, probably McDougall and then some depth problems aren't necessarily fantastic, but still a very good score and very good secondary.
Yeah, this is a really good secondary. Of course, Griffin, the UCF guy, has been very good. He's panned out for them. Diggs was a great trade, obviously, of that weird Matt Patricia firing off spree. And I think that, like I said on one of our previous podcasts, this is the perfect Jamal Adams situation because he's the perfect upgrade over McDougall. And that would make this a defensive 10. Obviously, he's still in the Jets, so it's not a 10. But 3 very good secondary pieces out of 4 puts it at a very high level.
Yeah. So for their defense, they end up with a 7.3. Again, their offense was a 6.2. This gives their total a very nice 6.9, which is also the second highest score we've had to this point, only behind the Vikings from last week.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I put them. I put them and the Vikings kind of on that same level, I think. Like we talked about, I think the biggest difference between the Seahawks and the Vikings, it's a very obvious difference, is the quarterback position. And, if you're going into a game between the Vikings and the Seahawks to potentially play one of the top teams in the league for a Super Bowl, I'm very confident in a guy like Russell Wilson over a guy like Kirk Cousins. Wilson is the kind of guy that can change a game basically on his own. If his offensive line holds up for him, which has always been the big if with Seattle, this team is good enough to win a Super Bowl.
Yeah, and also for Seattle, they don't need a great offensive line. Wilson he's proven he can play without a great offensive line, and Carson has proven he can at least have some success running the ball without a great offensive line. I think they should have a better offensive line, but, they can still have success without it. Definitely a team that can make things very far. And with that, we have the team that you have as the number 1 team. And I think you and I this week were on the same page with all 4 of how we would rank them. We have the 49ers here. Why are the 49ers your pick to win the NFC West for the second straight year?
Because they have the best roster in football. I don't think there's any debate about that. I think that, you can debate the Ravens as well. But I do think that what this team did with Shanahan and what this team did last season, they proved that they have, offensively, defensively, they have a very good team overall. I think the Garoppolo stuff's kind of overblown. He's not an elite tier, but he is a very good quarterback who was, a few yards away from winning a Super Bowl. He almost hit Emmanuel Sanders in the end zone for a touchdown that would have won them the Super Bowl. This team, the question that you have with the 49ers this year is the same question you have with the Rams bouncing back. Does this team suffer a bit of a hangover after, being so close but falling short? But I do think that what this team has and what this roster shows, I think that there's not a lot of holes. I think this is going to be our highest graded roster in the NFC, and it's going to compete with the Ravens for the highest graded roster in the entire NFL.
Yeah, no, the roster is very good. I actually do think they were better last year than this year, but not a lot. I think they're pretty similar. And so let's just jump into it. We have Kyle Shanahan, coach. He gets an 8, which definitely feels right. Maybe even a little bit low, but definitely he deserves at least 8. We also have Jimmy G. He got a 7. I am going to bump them up a point because I think Nick Mullins is a very good backup. So they get an 8 for the quarterback room and 8 for head coach.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I was just trying to think of what you had in the past for some of the other quarterback grades. You could probably talk me into a 6 for Garoppolo as he's getting better. If you catch Jimmy on the right game, he looks awesome. He's one of those guys. He played very well in a few big games for them, but he also played very mediocre in a few games that they almost lost or did lose because of it. If you look at games like the Atlanta game, he didn't turn the ball over, but he wasn't really enough of a game changer to make that game a difference. But overall, I think that this team, he's a good quarterback, and he's going to be that top half level quarterback that's good enough to win a Super Bowl, regardless.
Yeah, agreed. And we'll go into the offensive line now. Offensive line, I think, is good. Obviously, the biggest headline was when they, brought in Trent Williams to. They also to replace Joe Staley. So I mean, nothing too crazy there because you're losing a great player, but you're getting a great player. We'll have to see how Williams does, though. For the other tackle, it'll be interesting whether it'll be. I think it'll probably be Mike McGillany, whatever. I'm not very good at pronouncing names. Yes.
McGlinchey.
Okay, there you go. Who should be solid. You also have for center Weston Richburg. I think is fine, nothing crazy, but I think their guard play is both very good with Garland and Tomlinson. So I'm going to give the offensive line an 8.
Yeah, I think that the big thing with them was I think the big thing with this offensive line is there's no really holes. I think a guy like Tomlinson was good enough that there wasn't, you don't question anything on this offensive line. Even a guy like Trent Williams, who I personally thought before he started his holdout and wanting to trade was the best left tackle in football. And I think that he could still perform at a very high level. He may not be the best left tackle in football when he comes back, but they don't need him to be the best left tackle in football. They just need him to be a good left tackle, and I think he's still going to be not just good, but very good. So I do think that this is a good offensive line and perfect for what they do.
Yeah, and from that we'll move on to the sort of the scope. Wide receivers, and I'll do backs as well. For the wide receivers, Deebo Samuel and then Brandon Ayuk, who they just drafted. Those are kind of the two headliners. Obviously, they lost Emmanuel Sanders, but they still have Jalen Hurd, who they drafted last year, who was a third rounder, who I actually thought was really good, and he showed a lot of promise in the preseason. Then he was hurt for all of the season, so it'll be interesting to see if he can really step into that. I think he should at least be able to be a number 3 guy. You have Kendrick Bourne and Travis Benjamin for depth. I'm giving the wide receivers a 6. I also think that for the backs, Raheem Mostert, who, as of recording this video, is still a 49er. You have Tevin Coleman, Jerick McKinnon, Jeff Wilson, and then also maybe the best fullback in the league with Kyle Juszczyk. So for the backs, I'm giving them a 5. A part of that is because of Juszczyk. I think that a lot of what makes the backs work is because of the Shanahan system. I think a lot of what makes this receiving core work is because of the Shanahan system. So even though I don't think that maybe the overall talent isn't anything crazy, I don't think it matters too much with this team.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'd actually probably grade the running backs a little higher because, like you said, they don't need to be awesome, but they, I guess if you grade their individual talent, they're probably, you put them at a 5, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, for an individual talent, they're probably a 5, but where they're playing, they're probably a 6 or a 7 because of just what the offense does for them. I think what's really interesting is how much San Francisco has spent on draft capital on receivers for guys like Dante Pettis, for Jalen Hurd, for Brandon Ayuk, for Deebo Samuel, for essentially, so far, obviously you liked Hurd in preseason, like you said. I do like Ayuk coming out of the draft this year. So far, Deebo's really the only one who's worked out of those 4 guys. They're gonna. I do think that they'll eventually need another one of those guys to work out because this offense did get better when Sanders was playing and when Sanders was a very good receiver for them. I do think that another one of these 3 guys, whether it's Pettis, Hurd, or Ayuk, need to work out for this offense to reach its full potential again. But I still think that this is going to be very good offense because the system creates open receivers for them. And then, of course, I think Deebo Samuel is going to be a star in this league sooner rather than later if he isn't already. He only had 802 yards last year, but I just think he's going to be that good.
Yeah, and he's one of those receivers, can run any route, can do anything you ask him, good blocker, just good all-around player. I really like to see Samuel a lot. That was one of the steals of the draft of last year. And also one more thing, you can't talk about this offense without bringing up this man. Tight end, George Kittle, gets a 10 out of 10. One of the best, if not the best tight end in the NFL.
Yeah, he's still one of the top 10 players in the NFL. I'm not going to go as far as what Pro Football Focus called him the best player in football before last season. But I still think he's that good of a tight end because he can block at such a high level, better than the guys like Kelsey. I do think that he's still a phenomenal receiver. It's a 10 because he's that good of a tight end.
Yeah, he really does remind you in some ways of prime Gronkowski. Of like he can be that like elite. He blocks like a tackle, but then also can be one of the best receiving tight ends in the NFL, and it's just such a luxury to have. It's a matchup nightmare. And really good. So for the offense, they get a 7.4, which again is a very good score. And that's also with the wide receivers and backs only getting 11 out of 20 total points, which I think that, I think their 7.4 is going to go a lot farther than a lot of other teams' 7.4s. I think this is a very good offense. And we'll move on over to the defense. You have edge rushers. You have Nick Bosa, Eric Armstead, and D Ford. I went back and forth on whether it's going to be a 10 or a 9, but I'm going to give it a 10 because I think that they have, they have two guys or three guys who can all consistently rush the passer. I think three Pro Bowl level players, and that's not a thing many teams have. So I'm going to give them a 10.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the question you have with Armstead, of course, DeForest Buckner was so good for this defensive line. You question how good these guys are going to be again with that piece missing. I do think that the defensive tackles that they do have, as we're going to talk about, are still pretty good. I like the kid they drafted. And then Nick Bosa was such a game changer in year one. You only have to think that there's nowhere to go but up for him. He's that good. And I think in year two, he'll be just as good, if not better.
Well, my concern about Nick Bosa is that what if there isn't anywhere to go? I mean, sometimes we see these rookies that have great rookie seasons, and then, that's all they do. They aren't able to get much better because they already played so well. I think sometimes we expect that, if you had, 8.5 sacks the rookie or 8 sacks, something like that, then next year you'll probably get 16. Sometimes it doesn't totally work out that way. So I'm not willing to put Bosa at like that. I still don't consider him an elite edge rusher yet. I have to see him put up elite numbers or put up elite tape. I think he's still incredibly good though, and a clear number one guy, and he's probably a top 10 edge rusher. So, and with Armstead and Ford, that's why I give him a 10. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair. The depth of that edge rushing group with those three is, one of the deepest in the league, and they all are able to be productive, at least in spurts, in my opinion. I'm a little higher on both sides, I think, than you. I think that he is going to be, a premier edge rusher going forward. But you can question going for, you have to see it multiple times. Like I said, with some of the other positions, you want to see it more than just once before you're ready to go all in on it.
Yeah, and I should probably be maybe clear up my state. I think he's going to be elite too. I think he's going to be. I think he could be. I would probably bet he would win a defensive player of the year. But I'm just saying there's a difference between someone like him and someone who's already won a defensive player of the year, which is, like I'm not one like Khalil Mack or Bosa for one season. I'm taking Khalil Mack. Again, that's not an insult to Bosa. That's just kind of I want to be clear on where I have him. Let's talk about the interior defensive line, because I do think that losing Buckner is going to hurt them. I think this is that's probably the biggest loss. I know that they got an extra pick, and they eventually drafted Javon Kinlaw in the first round. My one concern is that sometimes defensive tackles don't necessarily, they sometimes take time to develop, especially bigger guys like Kinlaw is. That is a concern for me. They also have Solomon Thomas, former 4th overall pick, who definitely hasn't lived up to that, but is still good enough to earn himself a job. And then you have DJ Jones, who I think is good. For me, the interior defensive line, I'm giving it a 4.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think Jones is good enough to push this to a 5, especially if he's your number 3 defensive tackle. But, the question is going to be, Kinlaw has the toughest job, I think, of almost any rookie that isn't a quarterback that's starting right away. I think that, he's going to have to step in and replace a guy like DeForest Buckner, which is very hard to do. And, he's going to be asked to do that essentially right away. I'm kind of with you, though. I think he's going to be good long-term. I do think that this may end up just being a league average level defensive tackle unit because it's still a young player trying to get his feet under him.
Yeah, exactly. And I'd probably put Jones at number 2 and Thomas at number 3 as well. But yeah, I think that they have talent. It's not a mess. And it'll probably be very good in the future. I'm concerned about Kinlaw's age. That's all. I'm very much, I have to see it before I believe it. Let's move on to the linebackers. Linebackers, I think, are very good. I think they have Fred Warner, who's probably the headliner here. They brought on Quan Alexander, and he can't stay healthy, but when he does, he is very good as well. Not elite, but very good. And they also drafted Dre Greenlaw, who played last year, who played very good for them. So I think that the linebackers, again, I think if you have 3 guys who are all Pro Bowl levels, I think it's a 10. I think that's about as good as it gets.
Yeah, and I guess the question you have is if Quan Alexander isn't playing the whole year, which you
Mm-hmm.
kind of have to bet on at this point, is this group probably an 8 then? Because I think the other two guys are that good, but you kind of have to bank on maybe you're getting 9 games out of Quan Alexander is a realistic number.
Mm-hmm. That's fair. If you wanted to make it a 9 or even an 8 because of Alexander's injury history, I wouldn't fight you on it. But I think that the talent they have as a whole is very good. And we'll cap things off here, and we'll go with the secondary. Richard Sherman is the kind of guy who I feel like is the classic example of everyone forgets the entire season he had because of one bad game. That was the last one we saw of him. It wasn't great in the Super Bowl, but he did have a very good season last year. Again, he's a question mark because he is getting up there. He has had, I believe it was an Achilles injury, so that he had to come back from. So, and that was several years ago, but still could add some wear and tear. I do think Kwan Williams is good. Emmanuel Mosley. I think those are two. I think those guys can honestly be a 1 and 2 corner, even if Sherman isn't there, especially in this cover 3 zone defense. They also still have Witherspoon, and Jason Verrett is still on the team as well. And for safeties, you have Jimmy Ward, who had he went from being the guy everyone made fun of and he was the whipping boy to actually having a really good season last year. I think a large part of it was just because the defense around him getting more talented kind of allowed him to use his strengths and kind of hit his weaknesses. But I think the defense will be pretty similar again this year. You also have Tart, who I think is a solid safety. I think that as a whole, I would say the secondary is an 8. The one thing is, we've only seen one great season from Ward. I want to see a little bit more. And Sherman's age is what's keeping it from being a 10, but I still think it's an 8. I still think it's a very good secondary.
Yeah, I mean, not many teams can go 4 deep at cornerback. That's a big advantage that the 49ers have, even with a guy like Sherman. There's going to be opportunities, I think, for them to limit some of his some of his reps, I guess you could say, some of his play numbers, because they have guys behind him that can be very good in a pinch. So yeah, I do think I'd probably put this at a 9, maybe a 10. Like you said, we're going to see what Jimmy Ward, but I do think that the advantage to this team is how deep they are at cornerback and how much they can use all 4 of those guys.
Yeah, and again, if Kinlaw does have one of those, every now and then a defensive tackle does have a breakout rookie season, and if he does, this defense could easily become one of, if not the best defenses in the league. As of right now, it sits at a very good score of 8.0, bringing their total to 7.7, which is significantly higher than every other team we've talked about so far. The next highest was the Vikings, which was at 7.2. No other team has gotten over a 7 or even a 7. So definitely a good score here for the 49ers. And I think there's a couple of ways where, you could argue that's even better because, again, the wide receivers and backs, that's not as important for the Shanahan system. And the interior defensive line is mostly a low score just because I have questions, not because I think they're actually going to be not very good.
Yeah, I think that does this team address the wide receiver need again in in the trade market like they did last year? Or do one of these guys that they've drafted essentially step up so they don't have to worry about it? Like I said, they got 3 guys that I think could take a leap forward. And I do think that they are going to need that other guy. They're going to need that third guy because obviously the offense is built around a guy like Kittle and his strengths. You have a guy like Debo who can do just about anything, like you said. I do think that the question is going to be, can they find that third piece that can be very good? And then, of course, the running back room, I think a lot of the things that people forget is because, Mostert got his touches essentially because the running backs couldn't stay healthy. The thing with the running backs is everyone was just very good. If a guy like Mostert does get traded, can someone like Tevin Coleman stay healthy? And there is going to be a ceiling on this offense if the running backs can't stay healthy and they're going through running backs every week. And if they can't find that third receiver in my book.
Yeah. I think I agree. I think we're good stuff here. So to recap again, 4th was Cardinals, 3rd Rams, 2nd Seahawks, 1st 49ers. Not exactly breaking the wheel, but I think that feels right. Next week we should have the NFC South. That should be a fun one. We can talk about the Bucs. I think that'll be a fun podcast.
Yeah, that'll be fun to see us go back and forth. Obviously, you can talk down your team saying you're not going to win, trying to reverse jinx yourself. Mm-hmm. I guess my one question for the NFC South, as we're getting ready to wrap up, So if you look at the end of the season, do any of these teams end up with less than 7 wins?
For this upcoming year for 2020?
Yeah. Is there a possible where every team 7 wins or better?
Oh wait, are we talking NFC South or NFC West?
NFC West. Sorry.
Okay, gotcha. It's definitely possible every team ends up with 7 or more wins. I think that it probably won't happen. I think so. Again, one thing that's hard to do with these previews as well is just taking injuries into account. So that's why I always kind of say like this is more odds. So in statistics, it's not necessarily who like this team is definitely going to get there. Because I mean, chances are one of these teams will just have a bunch of bad injuries and will not only win 5 games because of that reason. But not taking that into account, there definitely is a world where every team wins 7 games for sure. There's a world potentially where every team in this division makes the playoffs. I mean, this is the first year that could happen where we're adding the third wild card team. Who knows? Maybe that could happen.
That keeps throwing me off with that third wild card team. I keep forgetting. I was almost like, wait, what? But then I was like, oh, wait, yeah, there's a third wild card spot. That would be crazy if the first year of that, all 3 NFC South teams make the playoffs. When I still remember the days where Charlie Whitehurst and the Seahawks were winning this division at 7-9. And then all of a sudden you could have 4 playoff teams out of it.
Hey, that division win brought us the Beastquake moment, though. So it was all worth it. Yeah, I think this is a very fun division. It should be fun to see how it all happens. And I think, Kyle, anything else before we sign off here?
No, I think we just about wrapped it up. That was good stuff. Obviously, like I said, the biggest question is, do the Rams bounce back and then the 49ers avoid the same fate as the Rams? I think that is the most talented division in football. But at the same time, if the Rams don't bounce back and the 49ers suffer the same fate as the Rams, saying it's the best division in football could look kind of silly, and the Seahawks could actually win this thing pretty easily if the 49ers kind of drop off. But I do think that the 49ers are too talented to do that, and they'll be back in the competing for a Super Bowl again.
Yeah, should at least lead to a good amount of fun games. And until next time, have a good one.
Peace.